Most people believe chemicals are the reason their garden survives, because without sprays, without treatments, without constant control, everything should just fall apart. At least that's what people are told, that insects will take over, disease will spread, plants will collapse, and, well, the garden will become impossible to manage. But something strange happens when people actually stop using chemicals, not immediately. At first, things can look worse, and that's the part nobody talks about, because when chemicals disappear, the garden goes through a transition, a reset, and during that reset, you start seeing what the chemicals were really doing. The first thing most people notice is more insect activity, and this usually causes panic. Suddenly there are aphids, beetles, caterpillars, things that weren't visible before, so people assume the chemicals were working perfectly, but that's not always true, because chemicals don't just remove pests, they also remove balance. Most sprays don't fully distinguish between harmful insects and beneficial ones, so when you spray repeatedly, you reduce predators too. Ladybugs, hoverflies, parasitic wasps, all the insects that naturally control pest populations. And once those disappear, the garden becomes dependent on continued spraying, because the natural control system is gone. This is why pests often return quickly after treatment. The predators were removed too, so now, the pests come back faster than the system can recover, and over time, the cycle gets worse. More pests, more spraying, more imbalance, until the garden feels impossible to manage without chemicals. Now here's where things begin to change. When spraying stops, beneficial insects slowly return, not instantly, but gradually. The garden starts rebuilding its food chain, predators begin reproducing again, pollinators increase, and eventually, the system starts regulating itself differently. This is why some gardens that stop chemical use actually become more stable over time, not perfect, but balanced. Another thing people notice is stronger soil activity. This one gets overlooked constantly, because chemicals don't only affect insects above ground, they can also affect life below the surface. Microbial activity, fungi, worm populations, all of these contribute to healthy soil, and when the soil ecosystem weakens, plant resilience weakens too. This is one reason some chemically dependent gardens, they need constant inputs just to maintain average growth, because the natural support system underneath has been disrupted repeatedly. Once chemical use stops, soil biology often begins recovering, slowly, quietly, and over time, that affects everything above it. Water retention improves, root systems strengthen, nutrient cycling becomes more efficient, and plants begin responding differently. Another surprising thing is that plants often become more resilient after the transition period, not because pests disappear completely, but because plants adapt within a healthier environment. Strong plants naturally resist pressure better, and when beneficial insects are active, pest outbreaks rarely spiral the same way. Now this doesn't mean every natural garden becomes effortless. That's unrealistic. Nature still has pressure, weather changes, pests still exist, diseases still appear. But the difference is, the system no longer relies on constant intervention to survive, and that changes everything. One of the biggest misconceptions is that chemical-free gardening means doing nothing. It doesn't. It means supporting the system differently. Instead of forcing control, you create conditions that reduce instability naturally. Healthier soil, better airflow, more diversity, companion planting, predator support. All of these reduce pressure before problems escalate. Another major shift people notice is pollinator activity. Bees, butterflies, hoverflies. These populations often increase significantly when spraying stops, because many chemical treatments affect insects indirectly, even when they're not the target. And once pollinator activity improves, fruit production often improves too. This surprises people constantly, because they expect fewer chemicals to mean weaker results, but in many cases, the opposite happens over time. Now here's something important: the transition period matters. A garden that relied heavily on chemicals for years usually doesn't rebalance overnight. The first season can feel messy, Because the natural predators are still rebuilding, the soil is still recovering, the ecosystem is adjusting, and this is where many people quit too early. They see temporary problems and assume the natural approach failed, when really, the system just hasn't stabilized yet. This is why patience matters so much. Natural systems build gradually, not instantly, and once they stabilize, the workload often decreases significantly because balanced systems maintain themselves better. Another hidden effect is reduced plant stress. This sounds strange at first, but constant chemical exposure can create environmental instability, especially when products are overused. And unstable conditions create stress responses in plants. When conditions stabilize naturally, plants often grow more consistently, not necessarily faster, but healthier, more balanced growth, stronger structure, better recovery after weather stress. Now let's talk about something most people never consider: observation. When people rely heavily on chemicals, they often stop observing carefully, because the assumption becomes, problem appears, spray solution. But once chemicals are removed, people begin studying the garden differently. Patterns become important, timing becomes important, plant relationships become important, and this awareness changes the entire experience. You stop fighting the garden and start understanding it. That's the real shift, not just removing chemicals, but changing the relationship completely. Now this doesn't mean every chemical is automatically evil. That conversation becomes emotional very quickly. But dependence creates vulnerability. Because once a system can't function without intervention, it becomes fragile. And fragile systems collapse easily under pressure. Balanced systems recover. That's the difference. The healthiest gardens are rarely the ones under constant attack and constant treatment. They're usually the ones with functioning ecosystems, predators active, soil alive, plant diversity established, natural balance constantly adjusting in the background. And once you see that happening, you realize something important. Nature was already managing these systems, long before humans started spraying them. Most people think stopping chemicals means losing control, but often, the opposite happens. You stop forcing the system, and allow the system to function again. And over time, the garden becomes more stable than it was before. Not because problems disappear completely, but because they stop escalating constantly. That's the difference people notice most. Less chaos, less constant reaction, less fighting, and more balance. Most gardens don't become healthier overnight, but they do become healthier gradually, when the system underneath is allowed to recover, and once that recovery begins, everything starts changing from the ground up.